Hi, welcome to chapter 4. In the previous chapter, we discussed white's 12th move alternatives in the 8th bishop d3 system, which is one of the major lines in Manhattan. Right now, we would be covering white's 9th move alternatives in the Manhattan. They are not so super critical, but yeah, it's still good to look at them. And one of the tries was recently tried by Gary Kasparov, so it does make a lot of sense to check these options out. Okay, without wasting any further time, let's get right into chess. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, knight b d7, bishop g5, bishop b4, e3, c5, takes, bishop d3, queen a5, and this is the first branching point. So in the earlier chapters, we had covered ninth queen c2 here, where white defends this knight with the queen. Here, we would be looking at white's three critical options apart from queen c2, which are rook c1, short castle, and d into c5. Okay, d into c5 is not so critical, but it's still good to look at it. Let's start with what Gary chose, rook c1. So this is somewhat inferior to ninth queen c2, but it does have a smart point. White's idea is that after we attack the bishop and gain space with c4, white wants to tuck in the bishop behind the rook so that this rook is not really undeveloped anymore. This motif of bishop d3, bishop b1 is quite typical in these QGD structures, but for the moment, we don't mind it because we got a lead in development, we gained space, and we won tempos along with it. As usual, our motto of fighting for initiative, making threats remains intact, and we play knight e4, attacking the g5 bishop and the knight on c3. White cannot take on e4 because of d4, and there is a double attack. White loses material. So white needs to castle, and this was Gary's point. So if you take on c3, bc3, bishop a3, we are now, okay, it's important to not take on c3. Why? Because our king is in center. And what does white do to such positions? What should white do in such positions? Open it up, open up the center, open up the board, use your lead in development. And this is slightly tricky for us. So what we do instead is we play bishop a3 and attack the rook on c1. If white plays a slow move like rook c2, we are absolutely delighted. We finish our development with castle. And again, as usual, white has weaknesses on the queen side. The light squares are super weak. The bishop on b1 now is just horribly placed. This queen is quite strong, keeping an eye on this pawn. The bishop is restricting this rook's activity. This rook restricts the activity of the b1 bishop. White is in great trouble. So, what was white's point behind all this? White's idea is that white is happy to sacrifice the exchange and wants to open up the position to exploit the lead in development with e4. And what do we do here? Do we take the exchange and give white the initiative? Absolutely not. What do? We play h6. Again, if you remember, we have already discussed this. It's super useful to push the bishop back so that it's on a slightly inferior square. If we castle, the bishop is looking here and here and here. If we push it back, the bishop's not really looking at this diagonal. It's just looking at these squares, and we have restricted somewhat of its activity. And once we have pushed it back, now we take on e4. We don't want to give up the control of center very easily. White has some tactical ideas. So we take on e4 first. Now white needs to play queen e2. This is very important. If white takes on e4, this is the right time to grab the exchange. Why? Because white doesn't have the pawn on e4, and if you're not able to play e5, the possible battery on the b1 h7 diagonal is no longer a problem. Here, white had ideas of queen c2 and creating a battery, but after this, white doesn't have the option, and we can comfortably take the exchange. So white needs to play queen e2, bring a new piece into the game. And what do we do here? Do we take exchange? Do we try to somehow defend, or do we try to somehow defend the e4 pawn? It's in the center, which means if we are able to preserve it, we would have a great spatial advantage. And that's why the strongest move is f5. We try to preserve the pawn. White has only one move, which is to play bishop into e4. If you take on c4, you're just lost. Knight b6. I'm getting this out. I'm taking on c1 and I am able to finish my development with short castle. If I'm able to keep a grip on the light squares, keep space, win exchange and castle, what more do I need? At the same time, you're also threatening e into f3. So white needs to open up the position. That's the only principled response, bishop e4. White's trying for an attack. And rather than giving it to white, we quickly hide into the corner of the board. Castles. And now we are going to win some material either with f into e4 or bishop c1. White does have some activity as compensation, but we have absolutely no problems. And again, from a practical viewpoint, it's just much easier to be black here. One thing which I think is good to add is short castle's not so great here because queen e4. And similarly, bishop ec1 runs into queen e4 check. So let's go back. Rook c1 isn't great. And if white plays dc5, we just play bishop c3, bc3, queen c3, give a check. White can't play queen d2 because of the hanging rook on a1. White plays king e2 and we win a pawn with knight c5. If white does nothing, we just have a solid advantage. So maybe white can try bishop b5 check, king f8. But okay, even though we are not able to castle as well, we have an extra pawn. Our threat is queen b2. White can't really win the pawn on d5 with bishop f6 and queen d5 because of the option of queen b2 check. And we either take this with a check or the b5 bishop with a check and keep extra material. So that means neither rook c1 or dc5 is challenging enough, but white can be principled and can sacrifice a pawn to exploit the lead in development with short castle. This is a very principled idea. White says that, hey, I have a lead in development, so you take my pawn on c3 and I eliminate one of your developed pieces. Your king's in the center and you haven't developed a couple of pieces, the c8 piece yet. So I would have counterplay. How do we respond to this? Firstly, by gaining space. c4, we gain space and make a threat. White needs to play bishop c2. If white plays bishop f5, which is the most played option, we don't take on c3 now. Since the bishop is active, we just quietly castle. And white has nothing better than playing queen c2, where we transpose to the main lines, in chapter which we have already covered in chapter 2 and chapter 3. So the critical idea is bishop c2. White says, hey, now I'm planning e4. I'm going to open up the position. What are you going to do about it? And our response is, okay, because you have wasted so much time and the bishop on c2 is misplaced, only because of that, I'm taking on c3, takes and takes, and white can't play e4. This knight is not, if the bishop would have been on f5, rook c1 came with a tempo. With the bishop on c2, that is not a problem at all. White's best idea is still rook c1. And what do? We get the queen out. Okay, it's important to note that you can't castle because of bishop into h7 check. That was precisely white's point. It is very trivial, but I lost to Arjun Erigaisi once back when we were youngsters on the second or third board of nationals in 15 moves on my birthday, which was horrible. After that, I never played on my birthdays. And yeah, I never fell for this bishop into h7 trap. It was in a different version. My queen was on d4 and white's bishop was on d3 and the queen on d1. He got bishop h7 and won the queen this way. But I missed a simple idea. And after that point, I never missed this tactic. All right. Rook c1, queen a5. We get the queen out, and now we would castle. We won't fall for the bishop h7 trap, just like I did a few years back. So white's a pawn down. We have a passed pawn now. If we are able to finish our development with short castle, we would have a great edge. How does white deal with it? Of course, when you have sacrificed material, the only compensation you can have is in terms of either attacking the king or activating your pieces. So white's best idea is to activate their pieces further with knight e5. We can't take on e5 because of d5, then the d5 pawn would be weak, the knight on f6 would be under attack. So what do? We have to castle, but there's a better way to castle by playing h6 first. We have already discussed this. It's good to push the bishop back. Once white does that, only then we castle. Okay, if white plays knight d7, the idea is if we play knight d7, sorry, too much of an extended arrow, then again developing this bishop is a problem. But here we can safely win back the bishop pair, h into g5, knight f6, gf6. We have an extra pawn, that too a passed pawn. The h2 pawn is now a weakness. The queen's coming in, and we just want to tuck in our king with king f8, king g7. This pawn is a nice shield, and black is just much better. So white needs to play bishop h4. And now the drawback of the bishop on h4 is that this pawn can't be guarded by the bishop, which comes into play after short castle. And what does white want to do? White wants to gain space, attack on the king side, f4. Knight d7 as usual doesn't help. Knight into d7. White can't double our pawns on the king side. And if we are able to finish development, we are just better. f4. And if the bishop would have been on g5, this pawn could have been defended after playing f5. But since the bishop is not on g5, we play queen into a2. The idea, let's say if you play queen f3, we are not afraid at all. We just come back. Queen a6. And the idea is, okay, I'll get my queen out of the pawn's way, play queen d6, then play b5, b4, gain space on the queen side. Those two protected pass pawns, absolute monsters. White is just worse. But the main idea for white was to play knight d7, and f5. The idea is to play f6, open up the king side. And this is where playing h6 has helped us. We can play this very strong queen a6. The idea is, apart from that this pawn is hanging, queen a3 was possible too. But apart from that, we have also given a king a bit of a cushion to have access to somewhat more squares. At the same time, this motive of playing bishop h7 and queen h5 was very strong for white. But with h6, white doesn't have that motive, because with king g7, we defend the threats on the h file. So let's say white plays f6, the most natural move. What do? We take on f6, takes. And now, if white goes for queen h5, if the pawn would have been on h7, there was a very strong mating idea. But we can play king g7. This is not we are not losing the pawn. White doesn't have that opportunity of playing queen g4. And if we are going to play rook h8 on the next move and consolidate, white does have play, but we are just better. They may keep in mind that we have 1, 2, 3 passed pawns, as well as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 3 extra pawns as well. So we have a significant material edge. If we are able to shut off white's ideas on the king side, we are just winning. White has play, but as usual, it's manageable. Nothing to worry about. And with that, we come to the end of this chapter. Okay, so let's go back. We need to be more critical about this idea of short castle, which is quite principled. Rook c1, we just play c4, bishop b1, knight e4. And remember, focus on development, focus on keeping center control. If you remember these two concepts, the line's very easy. If you play castle, we play c4. First, make a threat, gain space, and then take on c3. White plays rook c1. We don't fall into the trap as I did. Play queen a5, knight e5, and very important move h6, getting out of queen h5, bishop h7 ideas and making that e3 pawn weak. Bishop h4, castle, f4, and counter attack with queen a2. Alright, so that's it for chapter 4. We have covered white's ninth move alternatives in the Manhattan bishop d3 system, and in the next chapter we would go on with white's other variations in the Manhattan. Alright, see you in the next chapter.